In a stretch of New Mexico desert outside a small town called Alamogordo, there is a patch of ground that was once the punchline to the video game industry's biggest joke. Underneath the sand, crushed by bulldozers and sealed in concrete, lie hundreds of thousands of game cartridges nobody wanted. For decades, rumor said millions were buried there, proof of a company so drunk on its own success that it built a mountain of garbage and called it inventory. The real number, uncovered by archaeologists many years later, was smaller than the legend. But the company behind it was real, and its fall was just as dramatic as the myth. This is the story of Atari, the company that invented the home video game industry, then nearly buried the entire medium along with its own cartridges. The story begins in 1972, when an engineer named Nolan Bushnell and his colleague Ted Dabney founded a small company in Sunnyvale, California. They had already built a coin-operated arcade game together the year before, working under the name Syzygy, each putting in $250 to start. That earlier machine, called Computer Space, was technically the first coin-operated video game ever sold commercially, but its controls were confusing and it sold modestly. Their new company took a Japanese word for a move in the board game Go Atari, roughly meaning, "you are about to be struck." Learning from that first stumble, Bushnell insisted their next game be dead simple to understand within seconds. The result arrived almost immediately, a stripped-down black-and-white tennis simulation called Pong. 2 paddles, 1 bouncing square, and a single beeping sound. It was crude by any later standard, but it was addictive, and it was new. Within 2 years, more than 8,000 Pong cabinets had been manufactured, and bars and arcades across America were suddenly filled with the sound of that primitive electronic bounce. Atari's early success proved something nobody in the toy or entertainment business had fully grasped. People would pay, again and again, to play an electronic game. By the mid-1970s, Atari was a fast-growing company with a chaotic, freewheeling culture, and it needed serious capital to build a home version of its arcade hits. In November of 1976, entertainment conglomerate Warner Communications bought Atari for roughly $28 million, at a time when the company was generating around $40 million a year in revenue. Bushnell personally received about $15 million from the sale. The deal gave Atari the money and corporate backing to chase a much bigger idea. Not just games in arcades, but a game console sitting in every American living room. That console arrived in September of 1977. Officially called the Atari Video Computer System, and later simply the Atari 2600, it let players swap game cartridges the way they swapped records on a turntable. It was not the first home console on the market, but it was the one that made the concept mainstream, and it effectively created the home video game industry as a consumer category. Sales were modest at first, but everything changed in 1980, when Atari released a home version of the arcade smash Space Invaders. It became the console's first true killer app, reportedly driving around $100 million in additional revenue and roughly quadrupling console sales almost overnight. Suddenly, owning an Atari console was not a novelty, it was expected. 2 years later, in March of 1982, Atari released a home adaptation of Pac-Man, one of the most recognizable arcade games ever made. It went on to sell more than 7 million cartridges, generating over $200 million. By the end of 1982, Atari's contribution to parent company Warner Communications was staggering. The games division alone accounted for roughly half of Warner's $2.9 billion in annual revenue, and about a third of its total operating profit. Atari employed around 10,000 people across more than 50 facilities in Silicon Valley alone. On paper, this was the peak of American consumer electronics success, a company that had gone from a garage-style startup to one of the fastest-growing enterprises in United States corporate history in barely a decade. But underneath that growth, serious cracks had already appeared, and they trace back to a decision Atari made about its own employees. In the video game business of the late 1970s, the people who actually designed the hit games were treated by Atari management as replaceable factory labor, not creative talent. Programmers were denied royalties, public credit, or bonuses tied to the massive sales their individual games produced, even though, by one account, games created by just 4 of those programmers had generated more than 60% of Atari's total game sales in 1978. In 1979, 4 of Atari's top designers, David Crane, Bob Whitehead, Larry Kaplan, and Alan Miller left the company after their requests for a larger share of the profits were denied. That October, they founded a new company of their own, Activision, the first independent third-party video game publisher, built specifically to make games for the Atari console without answering to Atari at all. Atari sued Activision, arguing it had no right to make cartridges for Atari's hardware. But the lawsuit was eventually settled, with Activision agreeing to pay Atari a licensing fee, a settlement that, ironically, opened the floodgates instead of closing them. If a licensing fee was the only barrier to making games for Atari's console, then almost anyone could become a publisher. Within a few years, dozens of new third-party companies rushed in, some founded by former toy makers, some by breakfast cereal conglomerates chasing a trend, and some with almost no prior game design experience at all, each chasing a market that seemed to have unlimited appetite and even less quality control to slow them down. Store shelves filled with cartridges of wildly uneven quality, all competing for the same limited space, all wrapped in boxes that promised excitement the games themselves rarely delivered. Atari, which had once controlled both the hardware and virtually all the software running on it, had lost control of its own ecosystem. Nowhere was the resulting collapse in quality more visible than in a single, infamous cartridge, a home game based on the blockbuster film E.T. The Extraterrestrial. Atari reportedly paid somewhere between $20 and $25 million for the licensing rights, eager to rush a tie-in game onto shelves in time for the holiday season. To hit that deadline, the entire game was designed and programmed by one person, Howard Scott Warshaw, in roughly 5 weeks, an extraordinarily short window, even by the loose standards of the era. The finished product was confusing, repetitive, and widely regarded by critics and players alike as one of the worst designed games of its generation. Atari manufactured an estimated 5 million cartridges, anticipating a blockbuster to match the film. Only around 1.5 million ever sold. Millions more sat in warehouses, unsold and unwanted, a direct financial symbol of a company that had prioritized speed and licensing hype over basic quality control. E.T. was not an isolated failure. It was the most visible symptom of an industry-wide sickness. Retailers, staring at shelves full of mediocre cartridges nobody wanted, began returning massive quantities of unsold inventory back to Atari and demanding refunds rather than reordering. Consumer confidence in home video games, which had seemed unstoppable just months earlier, collapsed with startling speed. Meanwhile, an entirely different kind of machine was quietly stealing attention and shelf space. Home computers such as the Commodore 64, which could play games but also do far more, at a price increasingly competitive with dedicated consoles. Between an oversaturated, low-quality game market and a genuinely more versatile alternative sitting right next to it in the same stores, American consumers simply stopped buying. What followed became known as the video game crash of 1983, a near-total collapse of the North American console market that some analysts feared might kill the entire industry. Atari was the biggest name to fall, but it was far from alone. Rival console maker Mattel's Intellivision division and toy giant Coleco's ColecoVision line were both swept up in the same collapse. And across the industry, total United States video game revenue reportedly plunged from around $3.2 billion in 1983 to roughly $100 million just 2 years later, a decline of more than 97%. The financial damage to Atari was catastrophic and almost immediate. In the first quarter of 1983, the company posted an operating loss of roughly $45 million, a stunning reversal from the $100 million in profit it had reported during the same quarter 1 year earlier. By the second quarter, losses had ballooned to around $310 million. By the end of the year, Atari's total loss for 1983 was reported at more than $530 million compared with $1.7 billion in operating profit the year before. Warner Communications' own stock price was hammered by the news, and industry-wide, the crash was blamed for wiping out billions of dollars in market value across the American video game business. Faced with an unsellable mountain of inventory it could no longer store, distribute, or discount away, Atari made a decision that would define its public image for decades. In September of 1983, trucks loaded with unsold cartridges, including huge quantities of E.T. and Pac-Man, drove out to a landfill near Alamogordo, New Mexico. Workers dumped the cartridges into a pit, crushed them with a bulldozer, and sealed the site under a layer of concrete. Rumors quickly spread that millions of games had been buried there, and the story became one of the most famous urban legends in gaming history. In 2014, a team of archaeologists finally excavated the site on camera. An Atari official present at the dig confirmed the true figure. Roughly 728,000 cartridges had been buried, still an enormous number, but far short of the mythical millions, and a very literal, physical monument to a company that had drastically overestimated demand for its own products. By 1984, Warner Communications had seen enough. The parent company, having taken on roughly $240 million in debt tied to the collapse, decided to break Atari apart rather than continue absorbing its losses. In July of that year, Warner sold Atari's struggling home console and home computer division to Jack Tramiel, the recently departed founder of rival computer company Commodore. Tramiel merged the assets into a new entity, renamed Atari Corporation, shifting the brand's focus toward home computers before eventually returning to consoles. Meanwhile, the original coin-operated arcade business, still profitable and largely insulated from the home console collapse, was spun off as a separate company called Atari Games. The single company that had once defined an entire industry had been cut into pieces and sold off within a matter of months. The Atari name did not disappear after 1984, but it never again commanded the industry the way it had at its 1982 peak. Ownership of various pieces of the Atari brand changed hands repeatedly over the following decades, passing through mergers, bankruptcies, and licensing deals, eventually becoming more of a nostalgia-driven trademark than an active hardware innovator. Meanwhile, the crash Atari had done so much to cause reshaped the entire industry that came after it. Japanese company Nintendo, entering the North American market shortly afterward, studied Atari's failure closely and built an entirely new model around it. Strict licensing controls, mandatory quality approval for every third-party game, and a company-controlled seal of quality stamped on every cartridge box. In many ways, the modern video game industry's obsession with platform gatekeeping and first-party quality control exists directly because of what happened to Atari. Nolan Bushnell himself had already founded the restaurant chain that became Chuck E. Cheese in 1977, and he left Atari entirely the following year after clashing with Warner management over the company's direction, meaning the company he had started went on to make many of its costliest mistakes without him at the wheel. Atari's collapse is often remembered as a single dramatic image, bulldozers crushing cartridges in a New Mexico desert, but the real causes ran much deeper and unfolded over several years. A company that had built its early success on tight, disciplined engineering lost control of its own software ecosystem when it treated its most talented creators as disposable, driving them out to found rival publishers. It compounded that mistake by opening its once-closed platform to virtually anyone willing to pay a fee, sacrificing quality for volume just as the market's appetite peaked. And when a licensed movie tie-in needed to ship on a deadline, Atari chose speed over craftsmanship, mass-producing millions of copies of a game that had been designed in a matter of weeks. Individually, none of these decisions were fatal. Together, layered on top of a market already saturated with mediocre software, they turned a booming multi-billion-dollar business into one of the fastest corporate collapses in American consumer technology history, and left behind, quite literally, a buried monument to what happens when growth outruns quality control.